Sanctions may still be necessary, but so is dialogue. But you can't talk to Iran on your knees. You cannot be the demandeur. You cannot appear too eager to engage. You have to be tough, fair, and smart. And this will take time because there are no grand bargains out there between the U.S. and Iran. There are too many mutually contradictory interests that will prevent easy, quick mending of ties. But you have a timetable because within the next 2 years, it is probably likely the Iranians will be able to enrich enough highly enriched uranium indigenously in order to make a decision whether or not they want to weaponize. And then you may find that others, the Israelis in particular, will act. And you cannot allow, in this respect, the tail to wag the dog, not on an issue this critical to the international community and to American interests. 9, democratization. Your predecessor deserves enormous credit for putting on the agenda an issue which most of his predecessors ran away from, which is the issue of democratization, respect for human rights, rule of law, transparency and accountability in this particular part of the world. There are more democracies in Africa, a continent that was viewed and is still viewed by much of the international community as an economic and political basket case, than there are in the entire Middle East. But you, Mr. President, will not be able to produce and force that democratic change from the outside. Freedom House, Mr. President, an organization that studies democracy, came out with a report several years ago which identified 22 countries. That's it. 22 countries in the world that have maintained their democratic character since 1950. That's it. It's a very small club. It's complicated to be a democracy. Just because you have elections doesn't mean you're democratic. Be very careful with this one, because in the Arab and Muslim world today, when you have fair and free elections, it's the Islamists, the least corrupt, best organized, most motivated political parties that win. If you're prepared for that, fine. But don't push democracy and then turn around, as the Bush administration did when Hamas wins, and basically not accept the outcome. It's very tricky to maintain your credibility. You want to believe in free and fair elections? Accept the outcome. If you don't think they'll be pushed the way you want, don't push others to hold them. And finally, Mr. President, the second most important piece of advice I will give you, and it's not mine, it's one of your predecessors. And if I can speak personally here, the first and last president who ever had an impact on me was Jack Kennedy. And I was 13 when he was assassinated. But Jack Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusion. And that's where you need to be, Mr. President. An idealist without illusion. That's where America needs to be. Never giving up on the prospects that the world can be made a better place. But as you go through trying to improve it, do so, Mr. President and Madam Secretary, with your eyes wide open. Thank you.
Today we're listening to Aaron David Miller present a forum entitled 10 Things Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton Need to Know About the Arab-Israeli Conflict. Pardon? We will return to our speaker in a minute for our traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate questions now, and please keep them brief and to the point. We're pleased to welcome guests at tables hosted by Baker Hostetler and Abraham Miller. Thank you for your support. Now we'd like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Making her debut appearance at the microphones is our new Public Relations and Program Manager, Carrie Miller. Welcome, Carrie. Nice to have you with us. And also joining her is our Development Director, Jessica Leary Allen. Aaron, would you please come back up to the podium?
Welcome to Cleveland so soon. Do you agree that Israel acted in self-defense when the Israeli Army, Navy, and Air Force basically butchered 1,400 people in Gaza and over 5,500 injury? Or would you consider that a war crime?
I'm an analyst, not an advocate, and that's true for both sides. I can explain something to you, or I can give you my explanation, but I'm not going to characterize it using terms borrowed from international lawyers. The Israelis had two objectives: to damage Hamas's military infrastructure and to create a measure of deterrence, that is to say, to at least force Hamas to reconsider the next time they thought about launching high-trajectory weapons into Israel's southern communities, to have them consider and pause, just as the Israelis sought to create deterrence with Hezbollah 2 summers ago in 2006. When you operate from the air, I don't care how precise you want to be, and certainly when you operate on the ground with heavy weapons in one of the most densely populated areas of the world, you're going to kill innocent people, and the Israelis did. The question about whether or not the damage and deterrence they achieved was worth the political risks and consequences and the humanitarian disaster that they created in their wake is not a question for me to answer. Life is filled with imperfect alternatives. And I don't say this casually or in an effort to trivialize. Life's about a series of imperfect options. And bad options always create imperfect outcomes. What happened in Gaza was a tragedy. There's no other way to explain it. The alternative for the Israelis, and I'm not going to sit in judgment of what they did. I'm not going to judge them. I'm much more concerned, as I mentioned to you earlier, about us. The Israelis will do what they need to do. It's the way the neighborhood operates. It's always going to operate that way. They're not going to look at international law, war crimes, conventions, and international standards of behavior. They, like most of the actors in this region, deal with existential questions, the needs of their political constituents, and their own identity. And both sides, sadly, seem to believe they have a monopoly on victimization and victimhood. So they can easily ignore, or at least minimize, the consequences of their actions. The Israelis didn't intentionally set out to kill 1,200 Palestinians and wound over 2,000. How much they thought about it, how much they cared about it, is another matter. It really is another matter. So, did the Israelis, under these circumstances, have an alternative? Probably. They could have probably operated in 3-day increments instead of rolling through Gaza with a plan over a 3-week period, but that's not the option they considered. And that's my answer.
Mr. Miller, assuming that the favorite will win the election on February 10th, Benjamin Netanyahu, do you think that to achieve the purpose of, as President Obama campaigned for, Iran never having an atomic weapon, that Mr. Netanyahu will need President Obama's help to achieve that final and perfect outcome, or do you think he will, and what do you think will happen?